So good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. So my mother is from Northern Ireland. She's from Ballynahinch, just down the road. So it's good to see so many of you here today. And the subject is really, really important. You've heard from our Lord, well, my Lord, the Bishop. We can't call him our Lord. But this topic is really, really important, especially in light of today's vote in Westminster. The Parliament there voted quite closely, but did vote in favour of the assisted dying bill. We'd hoped we'd be able to persuade enough MPs not to vote it in, but unfortunately we were pipped at the post. So, yes, this is me. I'm Dominic Whitehouse. You've heard that I've worked all over the world, but it's palliative medicine where I'm most at home, and it's a real privilege to look after people who are coming to the end of their lives and also to help their families at that sort of time. I love my job. I love our hospice. It's full of fantastic people. It's often full of laughter as well. Smiles, fantastic care, and fantastic memories. And I'm desperate to protect it, to protect my patients and my colleagues so we don't damage the really good work that goes on there. I've looked after people dying in war zones, in NHS wards, in an Ebola treatment facility in Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak there. And I've looked after people, obviously, in the last 10 years in our hospice in Chichester. And one thing that struck me is that people, when they're dying, when they're coming to the end of their lives, they need the same things wherever they are. Those things are best understood by having a look at what happens in hospices and good end-of-life care generally. So tonight there'll be a few statistics, a few emotive topics. I'll try to keep it all bearable. I'll focus, as Bishop Allen said, on the sort of more rational and secular arguments. I mean, the Christians in the room, we all know that assisted dying is wrong and why we think it's wrong. These are arguments that you can use when you're talking to people who don't necessarily follow our faith. And we can talk more about the moral theology and the moral philosophy aspects of it afterwards, if you like, in the question and answer time. So we are in Northern Ireland, though. We're not in a part of the world where Westminster is in charge of health at the moment, because the Assembly here is back in action, I gather, from February this year. And long may that continue. And the Assembly has devolved powers for health, which is perhaps ironic because assisted dying isn't really health, it's the opposite of health. But anyway, that would include whether or not to legalise assisted dying in this part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And already there is pressure is beginning to build over here for that in Northern Ireland. And I think that will only grow, and that will be led by people like Dignity in Dying and the Humanists. And these are two fairly recent media events that have happened. So I'd like to set the scene, if you don't mind, by talking to you a little bit about Consuela. She's one of the patients we had in our hospice. She was a lovely lady. She was very troubled. She came from overseas and she had advanced breast cancer, sadly. She'd had several years of intensive treatment, but after initial improvement, the cancer had spread and it was now in her bones and in her liver. She had very complex social circumstances. She'd been married several times. She'd had several abusive partners. And one of her nieces had just committed suicide. And there was a real sort of sense of crisis about her health status. She was on our hospice books, but she kept herself very much at arm's length. And some patients do that. They don't like the idea of going into a hospice because they think it means either that they're going to die or that maybe somebody will bump them off. But then her GP asked us to increase our contact a little because her symptoms were getting worse. She was losing weight and the pain was getting worse as well. And her arm had swollen up enormously due to cancer in the lymph nodes in her armpit. And those lymph channels that take the fluid away were blocked. And on that swollen arm, she developed some sores and they were getting infected. And she found this horrific. She couldn't even look at her own arm. So one of our specialist nurses visited her at home and got Consuela to come in. She was a bit reluctant, but she came in for what we call a symptom control admission. She was in a very bad place physically, emotionally and spiritually. She'd had enough and she really felt she wanted to die and asked for something to end it all. She was really suffering in lots of different ways. And when she first got there, she sort of dismissed our help. She wanted to be on her own. But then after a few days of listening to her and showing her we understood, her situation, explaining to her what her symptoms were due to and how we could help with them, and getting her to believe she had some living left to do, we were able to relieve a lot of her pain and her anguish. And it was mainly our fantastic nurses that made that possible. They're very good at scooping people up, and they break down the barriers and they get close to the patients, and that's what begins to make a difference. So after a while, she was able to sit up and talk again and laugh with staff and then with her family when they came in. She started going to the art classes we have in the hospice, in what we call the day hospice, and we have spa treatments, massage and aromatherapy that can have from our complementary therapists as well. So she started going to these things and started living again. And after a couple of weeks, she was able to go home for a day and then for longer periods. And eventually she stayed at home for a couple of weeks with her families from overseas, came to see her, and she was able to spend time with them. And during that time, she was supported at home by our hospice nurses, our hospice chaplains and our social workers. And then one night, she suddenly became a lot weaker and had to come back to the hospice. And she was able to smile at the staff looking after her and just share a few quiet words. And then she died peacefully that night with her physical symptoms and her spiritual distress largely under control. So it was effectively a good death. So this is a roadmap of where we're going to go over the next half hour or so tonight. We'll take a little look at palliative care for those of you who are not familiar with what it is. We'll look at how it's delivered, where it's delivered, and problems it's facing, and hopefully debunk some of the myths about it. And then we'll move on to assisted dying, what that is, how it's delivered around the world, some of the definitions for it, and some of the arguments about the language used and the arguments for and against it, and its potential impacts, both in England and Wales, but also here in Northern Ireland. And as we travel down this road, we'll see it's the opposite of effective, compassionate end-of-life care. So this lovely lady here is Dame Cicely Saunders. She epitomises the palliative care approach, and she put palliative care and hospice medicine on a modern scientific footing in the United Kingdom. And we think of her as the founding mother, if you like, of our specialty. She did first work in the field at St. Joseph's Hospice in Hackney, and that was a Catholic hospice run by the Sisters of Charity, although she's not a Catholic herself. Her great quotation here captures the ethos of palliative care and all good end-of-life care. So you matter because you are you matter to the end of your life. And we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. As you can see, it's completely patient-centred, it's hopeful, and it affirms the true dignity of the sick person. The World Health Organization recognises these 9 elements of good palliative care on the slide. I won't go into them all in detail, but you can see that they embrace, as I say, the whole person, the physical symptoms, but also their psychological and spiritual distress. And also it supports the patient and their loved ones. It's not just the sick person, it's their wider relationships as well. But most importantly, palliative care affirms life. It accepts that dying is inevitable, but it's emphatically not about hastening death in any way. And especially in hospices, it relies on great teamwork to be successful. We mentioned dignity a minute ago. It's talked about a lot in relation to dying. And the assisted dying activists, those who want to bring it in, assisted suicide, claim dignity is really the same thing as autonomy. I say that autonomy gives you a right to assisted suicide. In palliative medicine, we see things differently. Palliative care, we see dignity as something inherent in every human being, as Bishop Allen was saying, very similar to the Catholic teaching and the Christian understanding of that. And that's the concept of dignity in the Vatican's recent paper. Again, Bishop Allen referred to this, Dignitas Infinita, which describes human dignity as coming from man being made in God's image. And it's reflected by a very similar concept, which is actually found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a secular declaration. But it too requires us to recognise the other for who they are, to be present for them, to recognise their worth, and it emphasises the value of human life in and of itself. And compassion is another fundamental aspect to good healthcare. especially to good palliative care and good hospice care and good end-of-life care. And this involves both suffering with the other person, but also taking the next step and acting to relieve that distress, as did the Gospel's Good Samaritan, as you see in the picture on the left there. And that's very different from the false compassion, which is used to argue for accelerated dying for those suffering. And that really solves the demand to share the pain and the suffering by ducking the issue, by ending the life. And it sends a clear message that the life isn't worth living. You'll often hear, for example, you wouldn't let a dog or a horse suffer like that. You'd put them out of their misery. But that mentality abandons patients. It's the opposite of the palliative care approach, with its compassion and being present for the sufferer. And that's the right way to act in the beliefs of Christians and Muslims and many others, of people of no faith at all. So that's a little bit about palliative medicine in general, and the sort of ethos behind it. Where does it happen? It happens mainly based on hospices, but not necessarily in hospices, as I'll explain. So in the UK generally, and in the Northern Ireland as well, much of palliative care is based there. These are really centre of excellence for care of the dying and the terminally ill. There are three main components, as you can see on the slide. We've got the inpatient unit, the community service and the day hospice. And the inpatient unit is what people think of when they hear the word hospice often. It's a sort of halfway house between a hospital or a single room, a private room there, and the patient's home, but it's probably more like the best hotel room you've ever seen in some ways. And people come in for two reasons. Firstly, they come in to control difficult symptoms such as pain, breathlessness, anxiety, or whatever. And secondly, they come in for end-of-life care if being in hospice is where they want to be at the end of life. But only half of the people who come into hospice actually stay there for the end of their life that time. About half of them go home again. So it's not a one-way ticket, and that's one of the misconceptions about hospices, if you like. Sometimes they come in and out several times. So the second component on the right over there is the community service, and that's got two main parts to it. We've got what we call clinical nurse specialists. These are very experienced senior nurses. They've often been ward sisters or managers before they've come to the hospice, often worked on intensive care, finally quite a few of them in our hospice. And they are often also trained to be prescribers of the medications we use. And they support people at home and liaise with other services, often over long periods, several months, sometimes even years, people with progressive terminal diseases. And then we've got something called hospice at home, which is more hands-on nurses and healthcare assistants who go in to help people during the last few short weeks or days of life who want to die at home, to enable that to happen rather than them having to go to hospital. So the third component there on the slide is the day hospice. That's sort of a bit like a clinic, but it's also got a physio-led breathlessness and exercise class service. It's got counselling from our social workers and counsellors. There are complementary therapies, as we discussed with Consuela, art and music classes. And sort of it's sort of, in a way, a halfway house between the community and inpatient unit. So a lot of the people being looked after by the community nurses earlier on in their illness might come in and out of the day hospice to take part in the classes or to come and see the doctors or one of the nurses in clinic. So sorry now, a few statistics. I did warn you. There's around 2/3 of a million deaths per year in the UK overall, and about 17,000 of those are in Northern Ireland. And half of the deaths take place at home or in care homes or nursing homes, about 6% in hospices and the rest in hospital. Hospitals generally are beginning to have a palliative care team on their own staff as well, but not all of them by any means yet. But it's important to remember that many of those dying at home or in care homes are also under the umbrella of their local hospice through the community teams which we talked about. So they would visit and advise family and professional carers and link them in with the hospice specialists where necessary. And when people are asked, most of them don't want to die in hospital. They want to be at home or in a hospice. And just as, because I did a little bit of research because I knew I was talking Northern Ireland, I think you've got 4 hospices here and they support around 12,000 people a year. And they were the figures for 22-23. So I think they're the latest that I've seen. We have an expert in the audience who might correct that if I'm wrong. And that's about right. Okay. So funding of hospice and palliative care, and this is hugely important for a couple of reasons, really, because it's important both directly because it impacts on service availability, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, because it's at the centre of the assisted suicide debate. And currently in the UK as a whole, we've got around 200 hospices and they care for around 300,000 people a year. For Northern Ireland, as I say, you've got the 4 hospices, so they see a proportionately smaller number. I think your proportion of hospices per head of population is smaller than the rest of the UK, which I was interested to read, actually. So, but both in Northern Ireland and in the rest of the UK, it's severely underfunded. It survives on charity and fundraising by good wishers and some legacy giving as well. On average, the NHS only meets around 30% of palliative care costs in the UK. I think it's a little bit more in Northern Ireland. It's about 40% here, I think. But it's still woefully inadequate. In the hospice I work in, it's much less than that. It's only about 13%, and that's the case for a lot of the smaller hospices. But as a result of this lack of funding, one study has estimated that in the UK overall, about 100,000 people per year die without good palliative or end-of-life care that they need, that they would benefit from. And it's important because also for those people, but also for their relatives and for society more generally, because such bad deaths are the ones that the people who are arguing for assisted suicide will pick up on and use to make the arguments in its favour, and it makes it seem more attractive in some ways. And there's a report in the Westminster Parliament recently into the funding of hospices and found that it's not fit for purpose at all overall, and more to the point, it's inequitable. I've said that you've got less hospices in Northern Ireland per head of population than we have in the rest of the UK. Overall, I don't know, you call them health boards here, don't you? We have something called ICBs in England and Wales. They're the ones who provide money for NHS services. But overall, that varies very much depending on where you are. In some places, it's £10 per head per year, per head of population. In some places, it's as little as 20-odd-p. So there's a real postcode lottery about whether you're going to get good end-of-life care. And we all know that our population is ageing, and therefore demand will go up for good end-of-life care. We do know that the number of people dying will increase by 25% in the next 25 years. So there's an urgent need for us to get our act together and make funding and provision of palliative care better than it is. And despite all that, the NHS actually, when it increases its spending on services, it's increasing it less for palliative care services than it is for the other services it funds. And as a result of that, we end up with headlines like this: hospices reducing services, making staff redundant. And all this leads to people dying in avoidable pain. And that obviously in turn leads to pressure for assisted suicide growing. And it's perhaps one of the reasons that the vote was lost by us in Parliament today. And where assisted dying has been legalised, it's been legalised in a few countries, as we'll discover in a minute, there's evidence that it's bad for end-of-life care. So this is a study of European countries, and it shows that any increases in palliative care spending were much lower in countries which allowed assisted suicide than in those countries which do not allow it. I'll try and make the pointer come to life. Is it working? Can you see a pointer? Oh, you can. Yeah. So if you compare the blue columns, whoa, it's jumping all over the place. Anyway, compare the blue columns with the grey columns. The blue columns are those countries where assisted suicide is not allowed. The grey columns are the countries where it is allowed in Europe. And for each of those three settings, so that's inpatients, that's hospice palliative care, and hospital palliative care teams in the middle, and community palliative care, that the increases in spending are much less in those countries which allow assisted suicide than those which don't allow it. And there's other evidence as well. Here's some further evidence. So this slide compares the data about the quality of end-of-life care. The last one was about the spending on it and how it increases. This is how good that care is. Because Britain, United Kingdom, has got the best palliative care in the world where it's available. And the 3 places with the best provision in 2021, which is when the latest of these 2 papers was published, showed that the 3 places with the best provision are countries where assisted suicide is not allowed. And in fact, only one of the top 10 countries in 2021 had legalised it, and that's Australia. And as you'll see, its ranking had fallen because this compares their ranking in 2021 with the ranking in 2015 when it was last previously looked at. And as you'll see, most of those places in this column here with assisted dying, or assisted suicide as we should call it, we'll come on to why we call it the various things in a minute, but the places with assisted dying fell in the rankings, often by many places after assisted suicide and euthanasia were brought in. In Canada, which is there, you can see it's fallen down to 22nd now. It was higher up before it introduced assisted dying, which it calls medical assistance in dying over there. Things are so bad that the authorities in Vancouver, for example, have stopped funding one of the hospices there because it refused to undertake assisted dying. So please do not believe those who claim palliative care isn't badly affected when assisted dying is legalised, because it is. There's more evidence more recently, but I won't go into all that tonight, but there is some other evidence as well that's come out fairly recently. And you know that the NHS too, more generally, not just end-of-life care, is in crisis. It nearly always is in crisis. This is Wes Streeting is the Westminster Health Minister as well, and he's recognised this. He voted against assisted suicide in today's vote, but that wasn't, and his comments weren't enough to sway people, sadly. And the recent Darcy report, Darcy is a surgeon who has been brought in to do Lord Darcy as he is now, to do reports for the government on various aspects of the health service. He's done a report that's just reported very recently on the state of the National Health Service in England, looking at that specifically. But he finds that there are all sorts of problems there, and I've flagged them up there on the right of the slide, but there are 2 that are perhaps most relevant for this conversation, are the huge increase in the number of patients per GP. We all know how much harder it is to see our GPs than it used to be, and the fact that more than 2 million people are waiting for community services or mental health appointments. And the mental health appointment side of it is very important when you start thinking about assisted suicide. And the danger is that these shortfalls could make people feel assisted suicide is the only way out. And people are also suspicious that assisted suicide might be about cutting costs. And that's perhaps not unreasonable. In 2020, Canadian economists showed that assisted dying brought in there would provide health budget savings of $149 million per year. And that's compared with normal care. And that was when there were only 8,000 assisted dying deaths per year back then in 2020. We're already at 13,500 per year. And as we'll talk about in a minute, they're widening the eligibility very greatly in Canada. So there'll be a lot more people having assisted suicide and euthanasia there, so they save a lot more money. Prof. Mark Glazer, who you might have heard of, he's a cancer specialist over here in Northern Ireland. He recently warned, if assisted dying is legalised, it will create a culture of hopelessness in the NHS. I think he's right about that. He said it will be a disaster for patients. And he added, but it might be good for the NHS budget. So then moving now on to assisted dying and the terminology that's used. These are the definitions from the UK government website, the Westminster website. But it's important to realise that these terms are all contested, and language is very important. You've already heard me switching between assisted dying and assisted suicide. I prefer to call what's being proposed here in the UK assisted suicide. In Canada, it's assisted suicide and euthanasia. But for the purpose of just defining the terms, assisted dying is an umbrella term which includes both euthanasia and assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is where healthcare professionals prescribe lethal drugs for a patient to take themselves, and euthanasia is where a healthcare professional actually administers the lethal drug to the patient, gives them an injection or whatever. There are other euphemisms used elsewhere. So we mentioned Canada. They've got something called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, MAID, they call it. Sounds quite pleasant, doesn't it? MAID in Canada. VAD in Australia, they call it Voluntary Assistance in Dying. But both of those, like the term assisted dying itself, they're used to avoid negative connotations by those who are in favour of bringing it in. In reality, though, as we've heard, they're all situations where health staff are helping people to kill themselves or more directly ending the lives of their patients. And morally, there's very little, if any, difference. So what's happening around the world? Well, we've heard about what's happening in England and Wales to a certain extent today. So far, it's legal in a handful of mainly rich, developed countries in Europe, in North America and the old Commonwealth. And in some places, assisted suicide alone is allowed. In others, it's both assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the assisted dying champions, that's Dignity in Dying and people like that, they highlight that over 300 million people have access to it now. And one of the arguments they're saying, well, we can't be behind the times in the UK, we need to bring it in as well. They hail it as great progress in those places. But there are 8 billion people in the world, so that's only 1 in 25 or less can actually legally have their lives shortened by their doctors. And there are actually 195 countries in the world, and of those, very few, around 13 or 14, if you add those up, very few permit it. And if we maintain the status quo, this is what I was telling people in England and Wales until recently, we'd be in good company with the vast majority of the world's people and countries. So try not to let them bring it in Northern Ireland would be my advice. So what about the UK? So the strategy of the assisted dying activists, as we've seen today, is to get decriminalisation of assisted suicide. And at the moment, they're saying it's for the terminally ill alone. Well, there's lots of problems with defining terminally ill. We might have time to talk about that later. But at the present, until this bill is turned into an act, which may be 2 years away yet, it's still illegal under the 1961 Suicide Act. There have only been 4 convictions, however, for assisting someone suicide in the UK in the last 10 or 15 years. So hardly anyone goes to jail for it. So we didn't really need to change the law. It's safe as it is. In Britain, Northern Ireland included, euthanasia itself is considered murder. I think it is in the south of Ireland as well. And these repeated attempts to legalise assisted dying here, they tend to use surveys and opinion polls as justification. We saw one on the press cutting from Northern Ireland saying that most people in Northern Ireland are in favour of it. That's what the people in favour of assisted suicide have been using as one of their big arguments in England and Wales as well. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And now, of course, we've got the Leadbeater Bill in England and Wales that looks as though it may well pass through all the various stages and become law in due course. A bill becomes an act, and when it becomes an act, it's the law. So those who want to legalise assisted suicide in public, they argue largely on grounds of autonomy, as we've talked about already, and choice, but also a wish to relieve suffering. But in the media and in campaign materials, there's a lot of misuse of statistics, there's some misrepresentation, and perhaps it's more misunderstanding about what good end-of-life care is and how effective it can be. And conversely, there's misunderstanding and misrepresentation about the serious problems where assisted suicide and euthanasia are already legal. So places such as Oregon. And Oregon is held up as a place where it's worked well, and it's the place that Kim Ledbetter says she wants to emulate in her bill. So we'll touch on some of these things as we move through the talk. So do keep listening, please. Okay, so... So just going back for a second then to the polls that seem to show there's a lot of public support for assisted suicide. Well, there are big problems with how they're conducted. So generally they're online. They select from panels of people who signed up to do surveys, people who like doing surveys, so often young, computer literate, and they're often given a payment or another emolument to take part. And obviously that in itself disadvantages those who haven't got a computer, who haven't got internet access, the illiterate, the poor. Those with visual impairment or mental disabilities or sometimes physical disabilities can't use a keyboard. So these are the very people likely to be impacted by assisted suicide. And it excludes almost completely those most likely to be affected, the terminally ill. And it also misses out the views of the other main group who are likely to be affected, the health professionals, because both health professionals and the terminally ill have got much more important things to do than fill in surveys. And secondly, there are big problems with survey design and question wording. So one study that was investigating this asked, do you support the idea of euthanasia? And about 79% of people said yes. But then when you change the question to ask the same thing in a different way, said, do you believe a doctor should be able to deliberately bring about a patient's death? That number dropped to around 30%. And that overlaps with a third problem. So people don't really understand the terms. So if you ask a group of people, do you support assisted dying being made legal? They think that includes allowing do not resuscitate orders or withdrawing burdensome or extraordinary treatments, like Bishop Allen alluded to earlier. And both of those are legal in the United Kingdom generally and in Northern Ireland. They're not part of assisted dying at all. Some people even think that assisted dying means having good palliative care at the end of your life. And obviously, as we know, as we've discussed, that's the opposite of shortening life by assisting suicide or euthanasia. And finally, as it does become more topical, people learn more about what's at stake and about the concerns of lawyers and doctors and other experts. In Scotland, numbers strongly in favour dropped, and even in England and Wales, when the public was surveyed more recently by Care Not Killing, support for it was dropping off as the poll came up. We'll go into some more evidence about that in a second. And last week, The Observer carried this article on palliative care doctors. They were highlighting the dangers of introducing assisted suicide in the UK, especially when we've got such under-provision and under-funding of good care. We had hoped that these clarifications, the Association for Palliative Medicine, which made this observation, is very much against legalising assisted dying. We hoped that the lawmakers would listen to this and it would make them think twice. It didn't, sadly, or not enough of them. I think a lot of them did think twice, but not enough of them to carry the vote. It does seem public vote views are changing anyway, though. Dignity in Dying, who are the ones in favour of bringing in assisted suicide, they did their own poll a few months ago, and they've not actually published this part of it, but it's very interesting because you find that only 43% of people actually want their MPs to vote for assisted dying. And it's only 24% among Black and Asian voters. And when I was telling this to Labour MPs in Westminster, because a lot of them come from constituencies where they've got a lot of Muslims in the population, a lot of people from Africa or the Caribbean, they started to get quite worried about that. Among faith groups, it was, funnily enough, lowest among Muslims at only around 19%. And it was also low in the younger people. The 18 to 34 age group had the lowest numbers. And among the regions, it was lowest in London. So the public are now getting very cautious about it and less supportive. And really, Parliament should have taken more note of that, I think. But now if we move on for a moment to why people actually ask for an accelerated death for themselves, they're very different from the arguments that are used for those who are trying to legalise it. And these are consistent across countries. So in reports from Canada and from Oregon, we find they're due to what we call existential issues, not about physical issues. So it's things like loss of dignity, loss of control, and it's fear of dying particularly, or fear of unpleasant symptoms in the future. But it's not usually by uncontrollable symptoms at the time they make the request. And worryingly, in Oregon, around 50% of people report that their reason for asking for assisted suicide is because they feel a burden to other people. And 10% cite financial concerns. And both of those are red flags for things like coercion and inequality. We'll come back to that in a second. So clearly, assisted dying can't help such fears and existential issues as we talked about, but they can be helped by some of our palliative care techniques. We explore what's important to patients, like we did with Consuela, as you heard, and their understanding of their own dignity and worth, and explore their fears, address those fears. And we call that, in posh terms, dignity therapy. It can be quite formalised, but it can be an informal part of listening to and accompanying the patients, which is what we do in hospices and palliative care generally. And that brings the patient to realise that life still does have worth and that actually assisted suicide isn't the way for them. So At the bottom of this slide here, we've got depression and hopelessness. These are quite important aspects to bear in mind when you're thinking about assisted suicide, because both of those make requests for a hastened death much more likely. And in one study, 1 in 4 terminally ill people with either depression or a sense of hopelessness wanted death to be hastened. And if you had both of those, it was 2/3. And we do know that depression is very common in the terminally ill. It's around 50% across various studies, and it's often missed. It's treatable, but importantly, if it's not treated, it impairs your ability to make decisions, such as decisions about whether to request assisted suicide for yourself. We're on the lookout for it in palliative care, but it may well be missed if assisted suicide is brought in, as we'll see in a second. And hopelessness too can be helped with psychology input, for example, CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and input from chaplains. But would they be picked up in all assisted suicide requests, especially when we know that there isn't enough palliative care or mental health care available on the NHS? As we talked about, there are 2 million people waiting at the moment. In Oregon, less than 1% of patients who have assisted suicide actually get a psychiatric evaluation before they die. And this obviously risks missing depression and hopelessness, and it must make mental capacity assessments, which are also important, and we'll maybe get a chance to talk about the safeguards in the British bill later, makes those assessments much less secure. And it's unlikely really that the UK or Northern Ireland, if it were brought in here, would be any more secure. So why is it bad for patients once it's brought in? Well, if you look at these graphs, you can see what happens where it's legal. The numbers go up inexorably. In the Netherlands and Belgium here on the left, that's been legal there for quite a long time, and still the numbers are going up. In Canada at the bottom there, it's not been legal for so long, but it's going up by around 30% per year. In Canada, it's mainly euthanasia. People can choose euthanasia or assisted suicide, and most of them will choose euthanasia because it's easier and it's more definitive. And that means that in Canada now, in the latest report, which was 2023 reporting on 2022, more than 4% of deaths are by a healthcare professional. That's 1 in 25 people performed that way. In the Netherlands, it's more than that. It's more than 5%. In Belgium, it's around 2.5%. But we know in both of those low countries, if you like, and we know in both of those there's a lot of underreporting, so the figures are actually going to be much higher. In Oregon, the numbers are lower, but if you look, there are 2 figures there. The higher figure is the number of prescriptions in 2023. The lower number is the number of people who actually died from taking their assisted suicide medications. And you can see there's about 1/3 of them don't use their prescription. So people change their minds, which also must tell us something about it. And the law is often tested. So as you see on this slide, we've seen criminal prosecutions for non-voluntary euthanasia of people with dementia in the Netherlands. And across jurisdictions, the law becomes more permissive. And you must have heard already about Canada. We'll go back to their figures here, because if you look at the last 2 years' slides, columns there's a little red bit at the top. Those red bits are because 2 years ago, Canada agreed that people who didn't have a terminal disease could also receive assisted dying. MAID, as they call it there. So these are people who didn't have a terminal disease. Their death was not reasonably foreseeable, and that's now allowed by Canadian law. And over there, they've now legalised it to allow it for mental health issues as well. Already it's being offered to the handicapped over there, instead of providing aids for daily living or modifying their housing. There's lots of horror stories you might have seen in the press recently. I haven't got time to go into them all now, but this cartoon sums it up quite well, I think. And similar mission creep is happening elsewhere too. Assisted dying or assisted suicide or euthanasia is getting more accessible, but help to live a fulfilled life is being withheld. So why else is it bad for patients? There are other good reasons. So diagnosis and prognosis are both often wildly inaccurate. So diagnosis is working out what's wrong with the patient. Prognosis is telling them how long they've got left to live. And so as you can see from some of these headlines we'll quickly look at, the diagnosis can be wrong. Well, we know cancers can be missed. They often are. One post-mortem study of people who died of serious illnesses found that the diagnosis was wrong in up to 20% of cases. But equally worrying, something might be diagnosed as a cancer when it's something else. So people get a bad prognosis, a bad diagnosis, and actually it's not something so serious. And then prognosis, that's how long someone has left, that's never as accurate as people think either. It can be out by up to 30%. And we see this in the hospice quite often. People come to us who've been told by their oncologist that they've got months left, they're going to see Christmas without any problem, and they're on their last legs and they die a few days or short weeks after they come to us. And we also see things the other way around. People who are told that they haven't got much long left, make your will and say your goodbyes, who come in, we sort out their symptoms, they bounce back and they can live happily and go home for several months. So, and this sort of imprecision causes fear, it causes anxiety, it causes people to lose trust in their healthcare professionals and doctors, and it may be one of the things that fuels this demand for assisted dying. In Oregon, in 2023, from their own government reports, we know that 5%, so that's 1 in 20, of those people who were prescribed end-of-life medication, assisted suicide medication, they were still alive more than 6 months later. So you're not supposed to be allowed to have it if you've got a prognosis of less than 6 months in Oregon. So they were getting it wrong there. Some of these people actually lived for 5 years after they received their assisted dying medication. Some of them did take it and died many years after they were prescribed it. Some of them are still alive years later, not having taken it. So they get it wrong in Oregon. So why do we think we're going to be any better, I suppose, is the question there. And there are problems with the medications themselves. Assisted suicide drugs are taken by mouth. They taste awful. They're difficult to take because you need to take large quantities, and the supplies are not always guaranteed. They're not licensed for killing people. No medications are licensed for killing people, and they're often used experimentally because people don't know what the best combinations are for this. Oregon is on its 8th combination of drugs already. And they also cause distressing side effects, such as vomiting or seizures. So again, in Oregon, because that's the place that the United Kingdom is modelling its new law on, this happens in 10% of assisted suicides, where we get the information. We don't get it in most cases. We only get it in a third of cases because the side effects are only reported on if there's a healthcare professional there when the patient dies, and that is only in a third of the cases. And what makes that even worse is that the healthcare records for people who about the assisted suicide in Oregon, they're only kept for 1 year and then they're destroyed. So it's hard to look back and find out what's really been going on. And the drugs themselves may not work. People can wake up after taking the medications rather than dying. In one Dutch study, several of those who wanted assisted suicide woke up and had to be given a lethal injection by their doctor and were euthanized instead. And for those that do work, again, going back to Oregon, their report tells the medication can take nearly 6 days to work. So where is the dignity in such deaths? The assisted suicide route does not guarantee you a dignified end. And we know that not all doctors are good guys. So you'll have heard of Dr. Harold Shipman, possibly, maybe not in Northern Ireland, but probably. He was one of the most prolific serial killers of recent years. He was convicted of killing 15 of his patients. It's thought he probably killed hundreds of them. We don't know why he did it. He may have been in the will of some of them, but most of them he wasn't, and it's thought he seems to just like killing people. We've got something called the Gosport War Memorial Hospital down on the south coast near we are. There's a scandal there a few years ago. Lots of people were dying who weren't expected to die, and it was found that was because they would be giving sedatives and strong morphine-like drugs when they didn't need them. And that's the people being prosecuted by the police at the moment about that. We've heard about Lucy Letby recently, the nurse who was killing babies. And there's other cases. And then there's the NHS perma crisis in the background all the time, always short of funds, always short of services. And if you're in hospital at any time, there's always managers trying to clear that bed for the next patient. And there's pressure on doctors and nurses to do that. And therefore, how is that going to interact with assisted suicide when it's brought in? So I'm going back to Canada because that's where things seem to be going particularly bad, particularly quickly. they're very worried there that assisted dying is beginning to kill and being used to kill those on the margins of society. And only 2 weeks ago now, the Ontario government's own coroner's office, own assisted dying monitors, reported they'd got serious concerns about this. People were being euthanized for unmet social need rather than medical reasons. And there are lots of examples in the report, but we haven't got time to go into them tonight. But it's pretty horrendous reading. I've had a look at it. And so safeguarding is going to be really important around assisted suicide in the UK if it becomes law. How could we be sure that coercion, elder abuse, carer fatigue don't influence people's requests for it? And these are very real issues. As palliative care doctors, we see them, GPs see them, but inevitably we often miss them because we're not trained to detect coercion. It's something that the police and the social workers are quite good at, but it's not something that medical professionals are good at. It's not what medical professionals are for. Going back to Oregon, because it's very illustrative of how things can go wrong. The assisted dying doctors there generally, from their own report, only know the patient for an average of 6 weeks before the assisted dying takes place. And that's because most doctors in Oregon don't want anything to do with it. It's the same in the UK. Most UK doctors do not want anything to do with it. So the patient's usual doctor will not be the one who's involved, which makes it much more likely that if you don't know the patient, you don't know the background, you're going to miss coercion, you're going to miss things like elder abuse, and people will slip through the net. And so turning for a second to the healthcare professionals and doctors particularly, because I happen to be one and know a bit more about that. So despite the efforts by activists, most UK doctors' organisations continue to oppose legalisation of assisted suicide. A few of the organisations are neutral, but none of them are in favour. And around the world, the American Medical Association and the World Medical Association are both opposed still as well. Notably, in the UK, we've got something called the British Medical Association, which has got a Northern Ireland branch. It did a survey of its members in 2020, and it found that most doctors don't want anything to do with taking part in assisted suicide. And moreover, it found that the ones who are most against it were those who look after people at the end of their lives. The GPs, the elderly care physicians, palliative care doctors, most hospital physicians and the oncologists. And the people who said that they would be in favour of taking part were the ones who don't look after people at the end of their lives. People like public health doctors, histopathologists, x-ray doctors and anaesthetists. So those, so that tells a story of its own. Recently, the BMA Consultants Conference, I'm a consultant, I'm a member of the BMA, I rejoined it to try and change how it approaches things like this. They passed a motion insisting that no consultant is expected to take part in any way, which was a minor success for us. And there are good reasons for why doctors are uneasy about all this. Firstly, it goes against the ethos of medicine, which we learn at medical school, and that guides us throughout our medical careers. So that's all based on the Hippocratic tradition, the Hippocratic Oath that Bishop Allen mentioned, and that's something that's been around for thousands of years now, and it sees doctors as having duties to their patients, duties to their colleagues, and duties more generally to society. And it sort of embeds compassion and respect for your patients and their inherent dignity into what you're doing. And as Bishop Allen says, it insists doctors must do no harm. And it specifically, if you can see the bit in red there, I've tried to make it a bit bigger there, it specifically prohibits us giving our patients poisons. And that clearly excludes assisting suicide or doing euthanasia. And this original Hippocratic Oath has been brought into the modern age by this Declaration of Geneva, which you see on the left. And that was brought in by the World Medical Association in 1948, just after the Second World War, because of all the horrors that doctors had been involved in under the authoritarian regimes that were around about that time, especially Nazi Germany, but not just Nazi Germany. And most doctors now, so that was brought in because they felt that the Hippocratic tradition had been lost, of how people acted within medicine. Because in Germany, for example, the first person that you saw if you got off the train in Auschwitz as a Jew or a homosexual or a Roman Catholic priest or nun who was going to possibly go to the gas chambers was a doctor, and he decided whether you still had some work left in you or you went straight to the gas chamber. So it was a very medicalised regime right up to the end. And they think that losing this Hippocratic ethos was the problem there that allowed these doctors to do that. And that's why the World Medical Association brought in the Declaration of Geneva. And these ideals are what most doctors in the UK and in the West generally still follow. And they underpin what we call the General Medical Council's guidelines on ethical practice. And they're still there, and they still very much adhere to the Hippocratic tradition. And all this is going to be undermined if we bring in assisted suicide, obviously. But why else is it bad for doctors? So I've got a friend who's a Canadian palliative care professor, and she tells me that doctors over there already are having to choose to refer to different areas of practice if they don't want to take part, because places like Nova Scotia very recently made it a legal requirement for doctors to refer people for it if asked. But also the doctors have to tell patients that assisted dying, euthanasia usually in Canada, is an option. It's part of the treatment options. So basically pushing them into it. And many doctors have said they'll resign there if their consciences are ignored like that. And likewise, it would cause a similar moral distress for doctors here in the UK. I did a survey of staff and volunteers in one of our UK hospices, and people would resign here too if it's going to be introduced in the hospices. And this moral harm's not just because doctors see assisted suicide as killing and therefore wrong. It's also because of the way it will destroy the vital trusting relationship between doctors and patients, the therapeutic relationship. And if that is broken, there's really, it would be completely intolerable. And so if a doctor was to take part in assisted dying, or even be obliged to suggest it to patients, people feel not only is it acceptable, they might also feel obliged to undergo it, or that it was the right thing to do, and we don't want that. And society more generally, we've seen how numbers keep increasing and how it's getting wider, the eligibility is getting wider in Canada. That's happening in other places too. So in the Netherlands and Belgium, people with early stage dementia can be euthanized, even though you can live for many years with mild dementia. In the Netherlands, terminally ill infants and children over 12 can now be euthanized, but the parent has to give consent. So where is the concern for the child's autonomy there? In Oregon, they've recently removed a long-standing requirement that you have to be a resident of Oregon to have assisted suicide. Is that an ice cream van? This time of night. So not only do you no longer have to be a resident, so people can come into the state from outside, so the doctors won't know anything about what's going on with that patient. They've also quietly allowed people to reinterpret what they mean by terminally ill there. So we used to think that terminal illness would mean a disease that would lead to death within 6 months, but that's not robust. In Oregon now, and the Freedom of Information request has had it confirmed by the Oregon health authorities, that it also means an illness that if you don't have treatment or don't accept treatment for it, it will eventually kill you. So that can be now considered terminal, and those people can now demand assisted suicide as well. So that might explain why people with diseases not usually considered terminal, such as arthritis or complications of a fall, a hernia and anorexia, have all had assisted dying in Oregon in recent years. So there is a slippery slope in all those places where it's allowed. It's more of a black ski run or an avalanche. And people originally not candidates for assisted dying are now included on so-called human rights grounds. Already in the Westminster Parliament, a group of MPs, Labour MPs, have got together. They're already trying to widen the bill before it's even got as far as being an act to include those who have non-terminal diseases. And we've also got another he's a former MP, he's not in Parliament anymore, called Matthew Parris, and he's calling for legalisation of assisted dying specifically so the elderly and infirm can be disposed of to conserve resources. So, and they're coming out of the woodwork and saying these things, and yet they still voted for it. It's hard to believe. So I think this move towards assisted suicide reflects a modern emphasis on identity and neoliberal values, and a sort of fading into the background of things like notions of collective responsibility, social justice. They no longer seem to be as important. Some of the Labour MPs who are more to the left of the party and people like Jeremy Corbyn, Diane Abbott in Westminster Parliament, they are much more focused on social justice, and they voted against it, interestingly, as did the people on the socially conservative side of the spectrum. And it was the people in the middle of the parliamentary spectrum were the ones who tended to vote for it. Again, in Oregon's recent report, it shows that 80% of recipients of assisted suicide are on Medicare and Medicaid, and that's twice the proportion in the general population. And those forms of health insurance, Medicare and Medicaid, are for people who are at the poorer end of the spectrum, the elderly, the unemployed, the disabled, etc. So this is a worrying year-on-year increase. It was much lower than that at one stage. It was 30% when they first brought it in. And it's a year-on-year increase in the less well-off seeking hastened death. And that's got to be a warning to us here as well. And that's probably why people like Jeremy Corbyn vote against it. And so suicide rates. So this is another issue. There's quite a lot of recent research on this, and it had been expected that when you bring in assisted suicide, ordinary suicide that wasn't end-of-life type suicide, or is there any kind of suicide that isn't assisted suicide by healthcare professionals, would fall. So the kind that the Samaritans are trying to prevent, they thought that that would fall off if you brought in assisted suicide, because people would see they didn't need to go for that, they could go for assisted suicide instead. But actually the reverse is true. And you can see that those countries where assisted suicide is allowed, the background suicide rate has gone up. It's gone up by 6.3% overall. And among the elderly, it's gone up by much more. It's 14.5%. And that's quite ironic, because originally the people who are arguing for assisted suicide said that they were sure it would bring the numbers down, but the opposite has happened. And that obviously fits with what we know is true. There is social contagion in lots of abnormal behaviours, and suicide is an abnormal behaviour. It's clear you don't discourage suicide by assisting it. So, nearly there now. So before I finish, I'll just mention motor neurone disease, because people bring it up. I mean, it's one of the diseases that is often used in the media by people arguing for assisted suicide as one of the worst diseases imaginable, and we're very cruel not to bring it in for these people. And it does cause progressive disability, it causes fear, and it causes you to be dependent on others. And these are all difficult things, there's no doubt about it. And another argument is that they should also be allowed hastened death to avoid dying of suffocation. There's a great fear of choking among people with motor neuron disease because of horror stories they've heard. But in fact, it's much less likely. I'll come on to that in a minute. But this chap here is Dr. Peter Scott Morgan. He was a well-known robotics and artificial intelligence expert. You might have seen if you dabble on the internet. And he had a sort of avatar that he spoke to people with, even though he didn't look like that. He was stuck. He had all sorts of tubes going in and out of him because he had a very advanced motor neurone disease. And before he died, which was 2 years ago, he was a great campaigner against assisted suicide. And he was completely paralysed. He'd been told he only had 6 months left to live, but he was inspirational. He said, "My overall quality of life is exceptional. This is despite being paralysed, having a short prognosis, having a feeding tube, having a breathing tube, and being on a ventilator, and not being able to communicate except through an eye gaze computer interface." He said, "My overall quality of life is exceptional. I have love, I have fun, I have hope, I have purpose." And he asked, how many doctors tell their newly diagnosed motor neuron patients that there's no such hope? And that's true. So people are given a very bleak story about their future, and that takes away a lot of the hope that you need to lead a good and fulfilling life. And I've looked after a lot of motor neuron disease patients at the end of life. Most palliative care doctors have. And with good care, they can live comfortably and they can die well. And motor neuron disease deaths, like most deaths, are usually peaceful. And choking in motor neuron disease is extremely rare. There's a 24-year study at St. Christopher's Hospice, which was the one founded by Cicely Saunders, who you saw earlier. Only one patient died choking, and that was back in 1968, just after they opened. There's another large study across Europe, and no one died choking who had motor neuron disease. So, yes, the great majority died peacefully. That doesn't mean that patients don't fear it, and they do have a strong fear of a distressing death, but we can help with fear without killing the patient. I'm going to click through a little bit to the end of this slide because I think this is important. So most importantly, I mean, for all those who are near end of life, and not just when we're looking after them in palliative care and in hospices, what is important is that when the patient is ready, you need to discuss what dying will be like, because if you don't discuss it, the fear will grow. But you have to go at the pace and the speed they want to. You have to find out what their fears are and address those fears. You need to do it openly, but go as fast or slowly as they want and as they need. And perhaps explain that as dying gets nearer, they'll want to do less, they'll want to eat and drink less. They'll eventually take to their bed, spend more and more time asleep, less and less time talking to people. But that dying is usually very peaceful, with the breathing slowing down, gaps in the breathing develop, and then quietly the breathing stops. There's very rarely anything unexpected or dramatic happens. And I reassure them, and all palliative care and all good end-of-life care doctors would do, that we can control the symptoms if they do come up, and we'll watch out for those symptoms. So here in the UK, we've had a lot of assisted suicide talk recently in the media, in politics, and today in Parliament. And we discuss it quite a lot at work, and recurring themes keep coming up. There's fear and anxiety around the effects on the workplace, on the service we offer, and particularly over whether we're going to be expected to participate in it. There's fear about change in general, there always is, and all this is made worse by a lack of information and a fear of ideological agendas being imposed on us, and that's, I suppose, at the root of it. And if assisted suicide is allowed in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland, which I hope it won't be, and there's time still, I think, to reverse that. We can talk about that in a minute. It will irrevocably damage the practice of medicine and make the public unsafe, and that's a point I make to the MPs, because I think the first duty of government is to keep the public safe, and it would threaten the fragile but beautiful thing that is good end-of-life care. So I ask you all, please, to help make sure it doesn't become legal here in Northern Ireland. So meet up with your MLAs, write to them, and pray and fast. There's a few final thoughts before I close. So firstly, you don't have to kill the patient to get rid of the pain, the breathlessness, or the fear of dying, or anything else. You just need to listen, recognise their personhood, their fears, and manage their symptoms very carefully. Secondly, a lot of the demand for assisted dying is because people think that dying is a terrible time. But with good end-of-life care, people will go away with better memories and want a good death like that for themselves. But we've got to provide that and fund it, otherwise they won't be able to see the good deaths. And I think you understand my views about Canada and Oregon now. So in summary, I hope you see why I think legalisation of assisted suicide is a bad idea. It would harm patients, it would harm doctors and healthcare workers, and it will harm the public at large. And I hope you see, on the other hand, how good palliative care, properly funded, equitably available, is a humane answer to suffering at the end of life. And of course, given that we're in a Catholic church hall, it's morally wrong. So I'll close there. There will be chance for questions. Thank you very much for listening.